I'd just like to ask Dr. Jones 2 questions, if I could, to save me wasting time refuting something which he probably doesn't allege. First of all, Dr. Jones, you wouldn't claim that the society was in schism before the consecrations, would you?
I stated what I thought was the case in the talk.
Well, you didn't make that point clear, but I'm presuming you...
I can read it to you again.
Well, you can, we'll settle that later. And the other thing I'd like to make clear, if you would, do you think that anyone who goes to Mass of the Society of St. Pius X automatically puts themselves in a state of schism?
Well, Cardinal Gantan said something along those lines.
So you do think that?
I think it's a legitimate interpretation.
It's your interpretation. That's all I want to know. You could just say yes or no and save me a lot of trouble. If I go... Yes? Yes? Well, Mr. Case says yes, right, so... The first little comment I'd like to make on what Dr. Jones was saying was I don't think he indicated once anywhere in his presentation, unless I'm still slightly jet-lagged and my mind drifted off, that we're living in abnormal times. Pope Paul VI, within a couple of years of the council finishing, stated that the Church is in a process of self-destruction. The whole of the presentation we just heard seem to assume we're living in the time of Pius X or Pius XII. In a time of normality in the Church, I'd agree with every word that Dr. Jones said, but we're not living in a normal time, which I'll get around to a little later. But I'd just like to start with a few basic principles. You remember the first thing you learned in the Catechism, the question was, why did God make me? Now, God made me to know Him, love Him, and serve Him in this world, in order that I can be happy with Him forever in the next. How does one serve God? Because it's pointless to say that one loves God if one doesn't serve Him. One serves God, St. Thomas Aquinas says, by practicing virtue. In order to practice virtue, we need grace. We need sanctifying grace. God could have imparted this grace directly to us on an individual basis, which is what Protestants believe. But He decided that He would impart this grace to us by our incorporation into the mystical body of Christ, the Catholic Church. Now, the mystical body of Christ, in its innermost reality, is really an extension of the Incarnation. The Catholic Church is Jesus Christ present in the world today, present throughout the nations and the centuries, teaching us and sanctifying us, as He did when He was on earth. The Church has also been compared to a house, the house of the living God, Domus Dei Viventis. And that house is built upon a rock, the rock of Peter. If we are to be Catholics, we must be in communion with the Pope. Doesn't matter what we think of the Pope, we're still bound to be in communion with him as long as he is the Pope. Now, the Pope is not Christ. The Pope is the vicar of Christ. He's infallible when he teaches us any solemn doctrine on faith and morals, but he isn't inerrant. That doesn't mean he can never make a mistake, an error of judgment. He's not impeccable. It doesn't mean he can never sin. You remember perhaps in the Gospel of St. Matthew, at the Last Supper, when our Lord said, "One of you at this table here will betray me." Peter got up very melodramatically. He was a rather melodramatic person, and said, all the others may betray you, I never will. And it said, so said all the other apostles or disciples. A few verses later we read the words, it says, and forsaking him they all fled. Now I've heard that described as the first collegial decision of the Pope in union with the bishops of the world. Then, a little later we hear the Pope denying 3 times that he knew our Lord had anything to do with him. You remember the occasion in Galatians when St. Paul stood up to the Pope and rebuked him to his face. I've been reading my Aquinas too. And St. Thomas, writing a little commentary on Galatians chapter 2 verse 11, says this: Paul, who was Peter's subject, rebuked him in public on account of the imminent danger of scandal concerning the faith. And as the gloss of St. Augustine says on Galatians 2:11, Peter gave an example to superiors that if any time they should happen to stray from the straight path, they should not disdain to be rebuked by their subjects. I could give you several examples of this in the history of the Church, but I won't now, as I know Dr. Murray is very stern on running over time. Now, where obedience to any superior is concerned, St. Thomas Aquinas gives us these principles as a rule of thumb. If our superior commands us to do something that is wrong or immoral, we have a duty to obey. Sorry, we have a duty to disobey. Yes, I must still be jet lagged. So where any superior, that would include the Pope, orders us to do something that is wrong, we have a duty to obey. Disobey, sorry, we'll try it third time lucky. If any superior orders us to do something that is wrong, we have a duty to disobey. You see, I'm such... Yes. I consider myself to be such a loyal Catholic and so obedient to the Pope, it found me hard to get those words out. Yes. Now, what if a superior orders us to do something that we consider unjust? Really, I would agree with Dr. Jones here. It mustn't be what we consider subjectively. It would have to be a command that was unjust. If a superior makes an unjust command, we have a right to disobey. We're not obliged to disobey. We could submit to it humbly. Now, every ruler, including the Pope, is bound to rule his subjects justly. Because the Pope, as Dr. Jones said correctly, he has absolute authority, but he does not have arbitrary authority. During the debate, which took place during the Second Vatican Council, prior to the promulgation of the dogma of papal infallibility, some objections were brought up. They said, this is giving the Pope arbitrary power. He can rule the Church like a dictator if this goes through. And a man called, they have, at all councils, they have a person called the relator. He gives the official explanations of what the documents mean. And he said, no, the Pope isn't being given arbitrary power. And the main restriction upon his power is that he must use his power to build up the mystical body of Christ.
This is Vatican I.
Vatican I. Did I say Vatican II? Oh, you'll have to excuse me for this, right. Yes, this was during the promulgation of the dogma of infallibility during the First Vatican Council. And as I said, the relator said the Pope is given his authority only to build up the mystical body. He can do nothing that will undermine it. And so the Pope is bound to ensure that all his teaching and his legislation builds up the mystical body, and also that he rules his subjects justly. Now, among the rights of the faithful that the Pope is bound to respect according to the 1983 Code of Canon Law, we have a right to make known our spiritual needs to the pastors of the Church. We have a right and even the duty to manifest our opinions on matters that pertain to the good of the Church. We have the right to receive help from the sacred pastors out of the spiritual goods of the Church, especially the Word of God and the sacraments. We have the right to worship according to the prescriptions of our own right. We have the right to a Catholic education. And this might be a little point for Dr. Jones and Mr. Case. We have a right not to have our reputation damaged or our privacy violated. Now, the Pope, as I said, is absolutely bound to rule justly. And I would say that, above all, the liturgical reform that followed the Second Vatican Council was unjust. It deprived us of our greatest spiritual heritage. A few weeks ago I was on the pilgrimage to Chartres, which was very encouraging for all traditionalists. There were about 15,000 people marched from Paris to Chartres. The average age was 20. And we had a beautiful solemn high mass in the cathedral and a message from the Pope saying that he was praying for our intentions, the main one of which was the restoration of the Tridentine Mass. Dr. James Hitchcock who, I don't know if Dr. Jones would consider him to be a liberal, but he says basically what it boils down to in the church today is that Orthodox Catholics are denied the right to exist. So, after the council, people made their spiritual needs known to the sacred pastors. We asked them above all that they would allow us to have recourse to the traditional Mass of the Roman Rite that goes back in all essentials to the pontificate of Pope Gregory the Great at the end of the 6th century. We asked them for bread and they gave us stones. I could quote John Milton. Remember, the hungry sheep looked up and were not fed. Now today at Mass, well, the Mass I went to anyway, I was very struck by the Gospel. It was the Gospel of the Good Samaritan. And I felt that that Gospel has a lot to say to traditional Catholics. We were rather like the Good Samaritan, and after the council, in a way, we were spiritually mugged. We were stripped. We were stripped of our inheritance, of our spiritual, ascetic, liturgical. Even from, if your child goes to a Catholic school, you're stripped of your doctrinal inheritance. Because if you can find a Catholic school where your children are taught authentic Catholic doctrine, you'll be very lucky indeed. And we were like the poor man robbed in the story of the Good Samaritan, lying beside the road. We could say the Pope came along, we turned to him for help. He didn't quite walk by on the other side, he threw us what I'd call a band-aid, to which I refer to the 1984 indult, in which he said if any bishop feels so graciously inclined, he can allow these people to have a Tridentine Mass with all sorts of restrictions that made it virtually impossible. And I'd say, without exaggerating, probably 99% or more of the bishops in the world ignored the 1984 indult. No Tridentine Masses were given. Our bishops, we went to our bishops, we asked them, especially following the offer of the 1984 indult, and we were finding that practically every bishop was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Although it mentioned in a recent article, you probably saw that, the plight of the papist priests too, in the Homiletic and Pastoral Review. They said many bishops now are wolves in wolves' clothing. They certainly passed us by. And I'm speaking now, I know, for thousands, tens of thousands of good, honest, faithful Catholics. Paul Johnson, who's not a traditional Catholic, some of you read his books, wrote in an English newspaper, the Daily Mail, at the time of the excommunications. He said, actually, the type of Catholic who supports Archbishop Lefebvre, they're really the salt of the earth. The people who've kept the church going all these years, the people to whom the faith matters. But thousands of us, we'd got to a state where we began to despair. We thought there was no hope. And then, and I hope this doesn't sound too emotional because we British aren't supposed to be emotional, but then along came a man sent by God, and his name was Marcel. I thought of that this morning as well when they were reading the last Gospel. Fuit homo missus ad Deo qui nomen erat Marcellus. He didn't walk by on the other side. He treated our wounds, our spiritual wounds, and gave us the spiritual food for which we had hungered for so long. Above all, he gave us the immemorial Tridentine Mass, which the Second Vatican Council had ordered should be preserved and fostered in every way. All existing rites, the Council said, must be preserved and fostered in every way. And what happened? The Tridentine Mass was destroyed. Archbishop Lefebvre has been compared rightly to St. Athanasius. He is the Athanasius of our times. Like St. Athanasius and like St. Eusebius of Samosata, he went into the diocese of bishops who are not acting as good shepherds to give the people the instruction, the sacramental grace, and the pastors that they needed. They ordained in the dioceses of other bishops. This would be considered outrageous, schismatic. And he gave a message. St. Athanasius gave this message, and apart from the word Arians, it could be the message that Archbishop Lefebvre gave us. Our churches are taken from us and given to the Arians. They have our places, but we have the faith. They cannot rob us of that. Now, in my country, during the Protestant Reformation, the Catholics had a little phrase they used when they met each other. They said, keep the faith, which is very appropriate at this forum. And the reason, I would say, hundreds of thousands of Catholics have kept the faith today is entirely due to Archbishop Lefebvre. He hasn't taken people out of the church. He's kept hundreds of thousands of Catholics in the church who would have lost their faith or gone into sedevacantism if it hadn't been for him. Now, what St. Athanasius did, what St. Eusebius did, and what Archbishop Lefebvre did, going into the diocese of other bishops, is a very, very serious matter. And it can only be justified by a state of necessity. Dr. Jones has already told you my interest in states of necessity. I'll just try and give you a little explanation of what a state of necessity is. There can occur in the church a state of emergency, urgency, or necessity when its continuation, order, or activity are threatened or harmed in an important way, and the emergency cannot be overcome by observing the normal positive laws. The emergency would relate principally to teaching, the liturgy, and ecclesiastical discipline. In such a situation of necessity, the pastors of the church may take extraordinary measures to ensure that the faith continues. That was why Athanasius went into the diocese of other bishops. That was why Archbishop Lefebvre went into the diocese of other bishops. The great point at issue here, of course, is, does a state of emergency exist? Well, I can't go in, I maintain that it does, but I won't go into it in too great detail at the moment. I'll try to do so later on. Now, on to the subject of schism. A Catholic who breaks the strict letter of canon law in order to uphold the faith cannot be accused of schism. The Code of Canon Law states that, not me. Whenever you hear anyone like Dr. Jones start saying, someone's legalistic, it means they know that person's quoting the law correctly and they're in the right. And they want to try and undermine their argument before they begin. Now, I don't profess to have any great scholarship in my writings. If I have got a merit, it's probably comes from teaching primary school children, that's 11-year-olds, for the past 30 years, is that I do, in school, if I have any topic to present, I go into it from all different points of view, then I try and synthesize it and get it down to a very simple explanation. And I want to assure you, the explanation of schism I'm going to give you now, it comes from the writing of Aquinas, Cardinal Cajetan, other theologians. This is the true meaning of schism within the context of Catholic theology. As Canon 751 says, as Dr. Jones quoted it quite correctly, schism is the obstinate post-baptismal refusal of submission to the Roman Pontiff and of communion with the members of the Church subject to him. Yves Congar, who's no friend of Archbishop Lefebvre, he wrote the article in Schism in the Dictionnaire de Théologie Catholique, which I think is the greatest work of Catholic reference ever published. And he explained, schism and disobedience are often confused. Every schism involves disobedience, but not every act of disobedience is schismatic. And I'm going to base myself on the authorities I just quoted. Another one I'd like to mention, a standard textbook for those studying canon law, was a commentary on the Code of Canon Law by two American canonists, Buscarin and Ellis. It was standard, I think, in all the seminaries up to the council. Now, the act of schism, they say, is found primarily in the intention of the accused person. The guilt of schism, properly so called, is incurred only when a baptized Catholic intends willfully and intentionally to sever himself from the unity of the Church by rejecting the existence of the papal office itself, by denying that the Pope has a right to command, and by refusing communion with those Catholics subject to him. That is, by refusing to recognize them as fellow Catholics. The refusal, even the pertinacious refusal to obey the Pope in a particular instance, does not constitute schism. But Dr. Jones may care to argue that. That's not me speaking. That, I said, is I've done some extensive research on it, and that is the consensus of approved Catholic authors on the matter. That one has to intend to sever oneself from the unity of the Church. Now, by no possible stretch of the imagination could anyone say that Archbishop Lefebvre intended to sever himself from the unity of the Church. If he had wished to do so, he could have ordained bishops years before. He needn't have got into these protracted negotiations with the Holy See. Now, I'm going to get legalistic now. I apologise for that to those who don't like one to get legalistic. I've got here a copy of the admonition that was sent to the Archbishop of Lefebvre, the canonical warning, warning him that if he consecrated the bishops, he would be excommunicated. I've got the Latin text here as well if anyone wants to see it later. And it says, since on June the 15th, 1988, you stated that you intended to ordain 4 priests to the episcopate without having obtained the mandate of the Supreme Pontiff as required by Canon 1013 of the Code of Canon Law, I myself convey to you this public canonical warning, confirming that if you should carry out your intention as stated above, you yourself and also the bishops ordained by you shall incur ipso facto excommunication late sententiae reserved to the Apostolic See in accordance with Canon 1382. Now, I find it quite astonishing, if this was going to be a schismatic act, that no mention of schism is made anywhere in this canonical warning. There's no mention of schism at all. Why is there no mention of schism made? Because if there had been, the Archbishop could have replied straight away that in the Code of Canon Law, there's a section entitled Penalties for Specific Offences. This includes a section which is called Offences Against the Unity of the Church. This begins with Canon 1364, which deals with apostasy, schism, and heresy. The canon with which Archbishop Lefebvre was threatened, as I've just mentioned to you, is Canon 1382. That comes in a totally different section of the Code of Canon Law entitled Usurpation of an Ecclesiastical Function. And I want to stress again, that was the only canon mentioned. Now, one could say, very well, let's agree for the moment that Archbishop Lefebvre was not in schism through consecrating bishops, which I think is quite obvious, but leave that aside. He's excommunicated anyway, because this offence carries the automatic penalty of excommunication. But any laws in the Code of Canon Law which establish a penalty, they're subject to what is called a strict interpretation. When any doubt exists, they must be interpreted in the favour of the accused. That is to say, if there's any doubt about whether the penalty has been incurred, it hasn't been incurred. Now, Archbishop Lefebvre said his reason for consecrating the bishops was that a state of necessity, in the sense that I gave to you just now, existed. I think objectively this can be shown to be the case. The principal point of a state of necessity is the continuity of the Church is in danger. And if anyone thinks the continuity of the Church in this country, in my country, in Canada, in Holland, in France isn't in danger, they've been living in blinkers since the Second Vatican Council. So, Canon 1323 says that if one violates a law in the code because a state of necessity or emergency exists, that person does not incur a penalty. So if the church is in a state of crisis, if there is a state of emergency, then Archbishop Lefebvre wasn't even excommunicated. The penalty is invalid. But let's argue again. Let's say there wasn't a state of emergency. Let's say everything's marvelous. Let's say mass attendance is going up every week instead of going down. Let's say the religious orders are holier than they've ever been. Let's say that the children of Catholic schools are learning more and sounder Catholic doctrine than they ever did before. There's no state of emergency. Canon 1323, paragraph 7 of the canon I've just quoted you says, a penalty is not incurred if the person accused believes that a state of necessity exists. Now, I don't think there can be any argument at all that Archbishop Lefebvre believed that a state of emergency existed. He said he did, and nobody has got any right to say that he was lying. We haven't got the right to say that about anyone. If he said he believed it existed, then we have to believe that he believed that, in which case he would not have incurred the penalty. Now, a very strange thing happened then. When the decree of excommunication came, they added a little extra to it. And it wasn't just 1382, they brought in 1364, schism. Now that's rather as if you'd robbed a bank, which would be very naughty. You're not supposed to rob banks. And you're arrested, arraigned, brought into court, and then when they read the charge out for you, they say you're arrested for robbing a bank and first-degree murder. The consecration of a bishop without a papal mandate is not an intrinsically schismatic offence. It wasn't in the previous code, it was only punished by suspension. If it was intrinsically schismatic, it would always have been, it would have been in the section of the Code of Canon Law dealing with schism, that's obvious. It wasn't. So, adding this, even if done with the approval of the Pope, cannot turn an offence that isn't schismatic into an offence that is schismatic. Now, Dr. Jones says the Pope is above canon law and he can do whatever he likes. I disagree with that completely. I explained to you earlier the explanation given during the debate on infallibility in the First Vatican Council, when the relator explained the Pope's power isn't arbitrary. That would be incredibly arbitrary if the Pope can just change canon law and his women excommunicate people just because he feels like doing it. I mean, imagine if you'd Alexander VI was going to have a little orgy and he didn't have enough girls to come around. He said, you send your daughter around to my orgy, I'll excommunicate you. That would be schismatic. See, would he have the right to do that? Of course not. It's utterly ridiculous. Well, I've asked 3 or 4 canon lawyers, and it seems Dr. Jones doesn't think much of canon lawyers. It's amazing. Professor Capone is a professor of canon law in the University of Florence, and he's an advocate of the Holy Roman Rota. I mean, he's one of the most authoritative canon lawyers in Europe, but Dr. Jones thinks he doesn't know what he's talking about. I asked 3 canon lawyers, they all gave me more or less the same reply. This is it. The Pope cannot just condemn people on his whim. The legislator can change the law, but is bound by it until he changes it. And the judge must judge according to the law. Now, what the Pope could do, he could today, he wouldn't even have to publish it. He could get out on the balcony at St. Peter's and say, in future, to consecrate a bishop without a mandate from the Pope is a schismatic offence. The moment he said that, it would be a schismatic offence. But the Pope promulgated the Code of Canon Law. He says that's the canon law for the Church, and he can't suddenly start changing the rules at his whim without actually changing the law book itself. And I think everyone here, or I hope everyone here, would agree that that's very reasonable. Now, I did ask just now Dr. Jones, who prevaricated a bit, whether if we assisted a chapel of the Society of St. Pius X was schismatic. I must commend Mr. Case for his forthright reply. He said yes. means that I'm schismatic, as I've been quite often.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, right. You shouldn't clap at someone being schismatic. Anyway, we're fortunate, by the way. Oh, before I get on to this, I'd just like to give you one little quote. I've got a letter here, dated May the 26th, from Cardinal Lara, who's the head of the Commission for the Correct Interpretation of Canon Law, as to whether consecrating a bishop without a papal mandate constitutes schism. And this is what he says. The act of consecrating bishops is not in itself a schismatic act. In fact, in the code where offences are treated, these two are treated in two distinct headings. There are delicts against religion and the unity of the church. A delict is a technical name for an offence. And these are apostasy, schism, and heresy. Consecrating a bishop without a pontifical mandate is, on the other hand, an offence against the proper exercise of one's ministry. For example, and you remember I was saying about intention, Dr. Jones's intention doesn't matter. Listen to what Cardinal Lara says, but perhaps Dr. Jones will say he doesn't know what he's talking about. This is what he says. For example, there was an excommunication of the Vietnamese bishop Nguyen Thuc in 76 and 83 for an episcopal consecration, but it was not considered a schismatic act because there was no intent to break with the church. It would be very pleasant if we could get an authoritative decision on this point, because it's a very, very serious matter. I mean, if I've gone into schism through going to Pius X masses, I want to pop off and confess it and get absolved very quickly. And hundreds of thousands of people are going to Pius X masses. Well, we've all got to be very grateful to somebody for this. We've got to be very grateful to the Bishop of Honolulu, Bishop Foederatio. Seems, yes, who's done us all a great service, because he excommunicated a group of traditionalists for having Pius X priests to say Mass for them and Bishop Williamson to confirm their children, well, which Mr. Case anyway says is schismatic. I'm going to read to you his words. This is what Bishop Foederatio said to these people. It's very specific, and we've got to be grateful to him for it. Whereas on May 1987, you performed a schismatic act, not only by procuring the services of an excommunicated Lefebvre bishop, Richard Williamson, who performed contra jure illicit confirmation in your chapel, but also, listen to this bit, but also by that very association with the aforementioned bishop incurred ipso facto the grave censure of excommunication as forewarned by the office of the Congregation of Bishops at the Vatican to all the faithful. Exactly right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Case. Mr. Case is exactly right. Someone else thinks he wasn't. Because the people in question appealed. They appealed to the Holy See, and when you appeal to a legal court, the legal court has to uphold the law. And I've got this letter here, dated June the 28th, 1993, from the Apostolic Pro Nuncio in Hawaii, who says this, because they, as I said, they put in a proper canonical appeal. Upon the instruction of His Eminence Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, I perform the duty to communicate the following reply, which I just received from him regarding the recourse submitted first by you and then by 4 other persons against the decree of the Declaration of Schism given on May the 1st, 1991 by His Excellency the Most Reverend Joseph A. Foederatio, Bishop of Honolulu. Now listen. This is going to be quite wrong if Mr. Case is quite right, but still. From the examination of the case conducted on the basis of the law of the Church, it did not result that the facts referred to in the above-mentioned decree are formal schismatic acts in the strict sense, as they do not constitute the offence of schism, and therefore the Congregation holds that the decree of May the 1st, 1991 lacks foundation and hence validity. So those people are not... I've just got a very tough smack on the arm from Dr. Mara. So I'll just, mind he gave Dr. Jones a smack on the arm too, and he carried on. So I'll just carry on literally for just one more minute. You can knock it off my 10 minutes. Yes, that's equity. Right. The final thing I want to say, I've already mentioned to you the case of St. Athanasius. Now, history has an extraordinary habit of repeating itself. And this situation has happened before. It happened in the 4th century during the Arian heresy under Pope Liberius, who was subjected to great pressure, but unfortunately proved to be weak. He excommunicated St. Athanasius. He joined with all the Arian bishops in doing this. He signed a formula of very, very dubious orthodoxy. And what happened? He was the first pope not to be included in the Roman martyrology, and St. Athanasius is a saint. Now, what my opinion is that future generations of Catholics are going to regard Archbishop Lefebvre as the saint, and because he preserved for us some of the most precious traditions of our fathers. Nobody now can get rid of the Tridentine Mass. If you'd been with me at Chartres at Pentecost, you'd see it couldn't. I would maintain now the traditional movement, the movement for the Tridentine Mass, we are the wave of the future. We're going to win out. And as I say, I'm sure future generations of Catholics, they'll venerate these sacred traditions as we venerate them, as our fathers venerated them, and they'll venerate Archbishop Lefebvre for preserving them for us. So I say, God bless Archbishop Lefebvre and thank God for him. But of course, I agree with almost every word Dr. Jones said there. Under no circumstances should we leave the church. I know Dr. Jones has formally excommunicated me. I think it was in his June issue. I did write to him. I said I got excommunicated before by the Pope at Palma de Troia, but he sent me a beautiful bull. I didn't even get any nice notification, just a little line, Davies is schismatic, which came as a surprise to me. I wish he'd wrote and told my bishop that some years ago, because I've been trying to give up teaching for years. And I work for the diocese. I've worked for the diocese for 30 years. I'm still working from the diocese, actually. I'm getting paid up to the 31st of August. And I go to a diocesan church every Sunday. And when we had the bishop come round to my school quite recently, he annoyed all the women with whom I work. I've had the miserable experience the past 25 years of being the only man in a school full of women. But they're all very upset when the bishop said the first thing I wish to do is to commend the high standard of religious education in Mr. Davies's class, which didn't please them at all. So I'd always been under the impression that I was a Catholic. But anyway, I mean, Dr. Jones knows better than Cardinal Ratzinger, better than Cardinal Lara. If he says I'm in schism, perhaps I better not argue with it. I'd just like to read you the conclusion of a little book I read, which I thought Dr. Jones rather liked this book, but perhaps I'm wrong. It says, it's called I Am With You Always. It was designed to try and stop people leaving the church. It ends like this. However lamentable the state of the church at present, however terrible the trials and tribulations we may have to face, Our Lady of Fatima warned us of them, we must under all circumstances remain in the bark of Peter, which is the one ark of salvation. Pope Leo XIII warned us in Satis Cognitum, the Church of Christ, therefore, is one and the same forever. Those who leave it depart from the will and command of Christ the Lord. Leaving the path of salvation, they enter on the path of perdition. Now, I insist, actually, that I'm a Catholic. I'm in communion with the Pope. I'm in communion with the people subject to him. That means I recognize them as Catholics. I was delighted when our Holy Father in Denver made that wonderful, courageous declaration about abortion. And I'll tell you something, one guess only. I can think of only one religious order in the United States where you can guarantee every single priest in that order agreed with the Holy Father on what he said. You see, Dr. Jones says, are people tainted? Is the Pope tainted by being in communion with weakling? That's totally the wrong question. The Pope is the head of the Church. He is the chief shepherd. We are all his flock. Has he got any right to allow someone he knows very well is corrupting the faith of the Catholics in his diocese? And we're talking about children. Has anybody ever here seen that dossier on weakling by Tom Phillips from Milwaukee? What goes on in that diocese is abominable. We're talking about children being corrupted by vile sex education schemes. And it's not just weakling, it was Hunthausen. Has anyone read that book, The Hunthausen File? What Hunthausen was doing, again, is abominable. He's undermining the faith. As I think, wasn't it Nixon, as someone said, the buck stops here. The buck for this stops on the Pope's desk. He did try to do something about Hunthausen. I'm sorry to say, he was publicly humiliated. He sent Bishop Whirl, wasn't it, into the diocese to be an auxiliary bishop. He was supposed to share Hunthausen's powers. The establishment of the modernist American hierarchy ganged up. Whirl was withdrawn and Hunthausen emerged triumphant. He knows about weakling because weakling was going to get an honorary degree at the University of Freiburg. And the Vatican specifically said this man cannot have the degree because of his ambivalent position on abortion. He's got a lot more ambivalent positions than that. But leave that aside. So I'm not talking about, is the Pope tainted? Should the Pope remove weakling from his archdiocese? And if he doesn't do so, is he failing in his duty? I'm not to answer, I'll leave you to decide that yourself. But it's not the first time we haven't had popes who do their duty. You see, it could be much. Pope Paul VI, you see, I'll give you an example here. The papacy, you see, it's a mixture of the human and the divine. And the only guarantee we have is God will never allow a pope to impose upon the church something that is heretical, something that's contrary to faith or morals. He doesn't say the pope is always going to put out good teaching when it's necessary. He doesn't say the pope will implement that teaching. We're in the anniversary time of Humanae Vitae. There's a wonderful example. Paul VI stated the intrinsic evil of contraception possibly more firmly than it had ever been stated before. That his teaching was undermined throughout the whole church, particularly in the United States, and what did he do about it? Nothing. And we had the spectacle in my country and your country of bishops and priests from famous Catholic institutions getting up in public, repudiating the teaching of the Pope on a matter of faith and morals, and they stayed in their offices, and they still stay in their offices. You've got this Antoner man is getting up. The Pope has said you can't even discuss women priests. Good. The Society of Pius X agrees with that. Antoner doesn't. No, I've got 2 minutes. Antoner doesn't. I mean, look at this man, Antoner. The Wanderer exposed him on this. He was a seminary rector. He was showing pornographic films in his seminary. Then, lo and behold, what happens to a priest today who shows pornographic films to seminarians? They make him a bishop. People went over to Rome and protested about this. And for some reason, Cardinal Dearden went over and intervened, and Antoner was made a bishop. And now Antoner is making a laughingstock of the church, an issue after issue after issue. And he's such a humble man. Apparently he doesn't want to live in his big palace or whatever you call them over here. He said he wants to go home from house to house and stay with the people in his diocese. I just thought, I hope he doesn't take his home movies with him. But yeah. So Perhaps later on, when the questions come, I'll say a bit more about this state of emergency. But I'm looking for Father Kenneth Baker said, in the United States, you have a de facto state of schism here. You are in... He says you have a Protestant American church which is separated from Rome. I'll give you a little quote. 1991. With each year, it seems that we get closer to an American church separate from Rome. For millions of Catholics, it already exists in fact, though not yet officially, de facto but not de jure. Even though the intense bureaucracy will not admit it, the church here is in bad shape. There has been a loss of morale and elan. But what should one expect? Listen to this. Is this a state of emergency or not? What should one expect when most Catholic children do not know the basics of the faith? Well, is that true? Yes. It's true. I don't know of a single school in my diocese, now I've retired from teaching, where the children get taught Orthodox Catholic doctrine. It's terrible. We've got an abominable religious course that's being made mandatory in Catholic schools, and they're going to check up that you use it, where they teach them more about Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism than about Catholicism. Right. You agree with that, then? Most Catholic children do not know the basics of the faith, when heresy is openly taught and defended in Catholic universities. What sort of church do we live in where the professor of liturgy at Notre Dame University committed suicide and was found to be a homosexual, the most rampant and perverted type, who left in his will a statement saying he did not want to be buried with any form of religious ceremony? That's the church we live in. I'm getting smacked on the arm again. So I'll just read this quickly. So we agree when heresy is openly taught and defended in Catholic universities, when seminarians have declined from 48,000 to about 5,000, that's some renewal for you, when only 14 million out of 55 million Catholics go to church regularly on Sunday. It is not an exaggeration to say that the church here is in a crisis. So Father Baker thinks we're in a crisis. You see, Dr. Jones writes about the crisis admirably. I write about the crisis admirably too, I hope. Lots of people do. What Archbishop Lefebvre did, he did something.